Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany. Thank you for joining us today. As everybody on this call knows, almost 2 weeks ago, rumors started circulating that the Trump administration is planning a new cap on US forces in Germany, which will result in a reduction of nearly 10,000 troops. On Monday of this week, President Trump confirmed his intention to draw down the number of US troops stationed in Germany from about 35,000 to a cap of 25,000. There are lots of views circulating about this decision, and I'm delighted to have two experts with us today who can share their insights regarding the proposed military drawdown and its implications for transatlantic security cooperation. Dr. Claudia Maia is the head of International Security Research Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, or SWP, based in Berlin. Her work focuses primarily on security and defense policy in Europe, but includes a strong transatlantic component as well. Claudia, thank you for joining us today.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Also with us is retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. From 2014 to early 2018, he served as Commanding General of the U.S. Army in Europe. He currently holds the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy. Ben, thank you for making time for us today.
Hey, Steve, great to be with you and Claudia.
So Ben, let's start with you. Many observers see this move as a petty decision that will primarily hurt American interests. Were you surprised when you first heard about the proposal to draw down the US military presence in Germany from about 35,000 to 25,000 soldiers?
Yeah, I really was. I first got a query from a journalist saying, hey, have you heard anything about this? And then a friend who used to work in the Department of Defense, or for the previous administration, brought it up, and I said no. And then I start checking, and three of the places I checked first, which were US military headquarters in Europe, had no idea what I was talking about. And then one guy said, oh, let me talk to you on a private phone later. And that was when I started like, wow, this actually there might be something here. Now, for sure, there's always been pressure to reduce US footprint in Europe since the end of the Cold War. And we got down from 300,000 to 30,000 by the time Russia invaded Ukraine. Been working hard under the Obama administration and also even under the Trump administration, growing capability back. And 2 months ago, there was an announcement about a core headquarters coming back to Europe. So to have a U-turn like this really was honestly, I think everybody over here was caught flat-footed, including the Americans.
Well, obviously, there was a lack of consultation, both with our NATO allies, but also within the US government. But that sort of leads to a following question that I would have for you is how much thought do you think went into this decision? And specifically, I want to ask you about one of the tweets you posted yesterday, where you pointed out that US capabilities are already spread thin and that a reduction by nearly a third might render US military capabilities incapable. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. This is clearly a purely political calculation, a political decision. It has no connection to any strategic analysis, because there's no professional strategic analysis would have led you to conclude that, hey, let's reduce American capability of what's based in Germany and we'll be better, or America will be safer, or the alliance will be stronger. Zero. It also clearly was not the result of the traditional interagency process where Department of State, all the different elements of Department of Defense, the National Security Council, the Congress. I mean, the Congress was flat-footed. You saw Senator Inhofe, a Republican chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. He was not too happy about it. He heard about it on Twitter, and he immediately blamed former Ambassador Grinnell. So when you've got your own a Republican SASC committee chairman is not consulted, I mean, that speaks volumes. And then today, I listened or read where our very capable ambassador to NATO, Ambassador Kay Bailey Hutchison, she clearly had not been informed, and she's doing her best. She said, well, we don't have a plan yet. We're not sure when it's going to happen. So I mean, all of these are manifestations of a purely political calculation that was done, and no consultation. I spoke to a very senior officer at the Bundeswehr. He said, "Hey, we've had no notification. I read the same article you did." That's the extent of it. Now, my comment was, if there's 34,000 Americans, Army and Air Force total, that are permanently stationed in Germany. That's not yours, that's in Germany. Most of them, particularly the Army, are here to enable rapid reinforcement. So we're talking about logisticians, engineers, headquarters, intelligence, communications, and as a result of all the drawdowns over the years, we have one of each. There's one Patriot Air Defense Battalion. There's one Transportation Battalion. There's one Engineer Battalion. There's one Special Forces Battalion. So when you say a 30% cut, and I read where Ambassador Grinnell said, hey, there'll still be 25,000 people there, clearly he has no clue about what U.S. troops are doing in Germany, why they're here. So a 30% cut of one of each is in effect a 100% cut. So that's the damage that we're talking about.
And we can get to some of the security implications about this in just a minute, but Claudia, I'd like to bring you into the conversation as well. I've been reading a lot about the German responses to this decision, beginning with the concerns over the lack of consultation, but also statements from various political leaders. What's your take on the decision and the German responses?
I mean, the German reaction was first also to be utterly puzzled. Ben already outlined that there was no coordination. And so when the first questions came to the German government, they couldn't really react because they didn't have the information either. So I think there was this big puzzlement, what is actually going on. And then very quickly, there were very critical voices in Germany about this way of interaction with an ally. I mean, this is not the way you treat an ally, that you don't coordinate, that you don't inform, but that you get the news actually from the press. So there was irritation about the way of communication, but there was particularly irritation about the content. So to withdraw a third, and also the second kind of pillar of this decision, to limit the US number apparently to 25,000. So there was a big irritation about both the way this happened and the content. And the German government very quickly made it very clear that they would prefer to keep the US troops in Europe, because those who are in Germany are not there only for Germany, but they're out of American interest, and particularly for European defense. So we cannot scale this issue down to an American-German problem. This is an issue for European defense as such. So the German government insisted on that one. And they also insisted very clearly that this is important in terms of transatlantic relationship, understanding, bridge, to keep those troops in Germany. The head of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the German Parliament had a very clear tweet, and I read, "We want them to stay in part because they put a human face on the transatlantic relationship. Their social integration into our society is at least as important for a positive view of America and Germany as the security dimension." So there was a very clear statement, but I think the problem or the issue in Germany is that most people don't see it only as a withdrawal of troops, but they see it as an example of the very difficult, complex and strained transatlantic relationship. Yet another example how difficult the relationship has become. The US president called Europe a foe. This is not a way to treat an ally. So on the one hand, this is an overarching bigger question that it's difficult in transatlantic relations, and it's also difficult because the Europeans don't really know to answer in secure and defense terms. So we are not able in the moment as Europeans to replace those American capabilities. So it's, from all perspectives, very irritating and very difficult.
So Claudia, I know that you want to talk about the big picture and the context of this decision. And I guess I have sort of two questions for you. One is, do you think the timing of this decision is coincidental? After all, this announcement came shortly after what was perceived by some as a snub when Chancellor Merkel declined an invitation to a G7 meeting in the United States this month. But also, what are the broader implications of this? You started to touch on that a little bit.
It might be a reaction to that G7 invitation, but to be very honest, it is not a surprise. I mean, if you look at the interaction, at the relationship since President Trump took office, it has been very erratic. It has been very complex. So the timing might there might be a reason, but overall, the decision as such is not surprising. I think we seem to be surprised in Europe because we still don't want to believe in this changing relationship. We still want to see the US as our most important ally, with whom we share a common basis of values and common interests. And we really struggle in Europe to recognize that this transatlantic relationship has fundamentally changed. And I'm not talking about the expectation of the US government that Europeans should do more for their defense. I totally agree. All American presidents called for that. But what we are seeing since the current administration took office is a structural, substantial change. I very often compare the transatlantic relationship to a Greek temple, where I say the basis is the way how we see the world, our common values and norms. And then we have the pillars, which are the policy areas: foreign policy, trade, climate, defense. And the common basis is getting very fragile. Do we see the world in the same way? Do we think that alliances is something worth fighting for? Do we think that negotiations and treaties like the Iran deal, like New START, is worth to be kept? Or do we think that power politics is better? So the value, the basis is fragile. And in each pillar, in each policy field, we have fundamentally different opinions. Do we believe in climate change or not? Do we think that the Iran deal was good or not? Do we think that alliances like NATO is worth being kept or not? And then we have the roof, and the roof is the common objectives, the common interests. And there we also disagree. We agree that China is a challenge, but the US is totally focusing on great power competition, with China being the major challenger in economic, military, financial terms. So we always had problems in the transatlantic relationship, but what we observe in the moment is a challenge, a fragilization of the whole basis. And this is particularly in the area of defense difficult, because in the defense area, we Europeans depend on the US. So having a critical relationship with someone upon which you depend in defense terms, it's not a nice situation.
Ben, I saw you raise your hand before. Did you want to jump in on this?
If I can, and this will probably be one of the few times in my life that I don't completely agree with Claudia. So, you know, the relationship between the United States and Germany goes back to before the American Civil War. I mean, our relationship has survived 2 world wars. And one administration is not going to smash this relationship. But for sure, it's headed in the wrong direction. For sure, the current administration has poured gasoline, has accelerated the fragilization that Claudia talked about. But, you know, I showed up in Germany in 2014 as the new commander of U.S. Army Europe, and it was already 2 years before Trump became President Trump became president. It was already going in a bad direction. Even during the time of President Obama, who had probably a 90% favorability rating in Germany, and clearly the personal relationship between those two was superb. But the U.S. desire to have Germany join TTIP failed. Hundreds of thousands of protesters in Berlin. This is at the time of President Obama and Ambassador Emerson, one of the most well-liked U.S. ambassadors in Berlin in quite some time. So, you know, great relationship at the top does not automatically translate into policy agreement. And I would say it's fair to say that just because the two at the top have what's obviously not a good relationship, doesn't mean that the relationship in depth in business and universities and defense and academia can't still be positive. I love it over here in Frankfurt when I hear American voices. You see tourists still coming here, or students that are here, people working here. This is very important. And so I think while this is exactly not how to talk to allies, the way the president and former Ambassador Brunel talked to our German ally, it's absolutely the worst possible way to do it. We're not in a good place right now. I don't like the tendency of the administration to walk away from everything that it doesn't like. I mean, Germans appreciate, for a variety of reasons, multilateral, international organizations, structures, treaties, and this administration has a tendency to, I don't like that, we're leaving it. JCPOA, open skies, you name it. No matter how justified they might be. I would prefer that this administration lead, not leave all the time. But Germany has got to do more. And I'm not talking about 2%. I'm talking about lead. I think Germans don't trust themselves, actually. Germany knew that Russia had been in violation of the INF Treaty. They knew that for years. And Germany is probably the only country that can influence Kremlin behavior. Not the US, not the UK, not France, Germany. Germany is probably the only country that can influence the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party. Nobody else. And that's because, obviously, economic power, leadership within the European Union, but also the moral authority that Germany has earned over the last 7 decades. This brand, made in Germany, is respected everywhere, even if countries don't like it. The brand is so respected, but there is a strategic inertia in Berlin, a reluctance to have a meaningful debate inside Germany about how Germans see themselves. And so it's easy to criticize the US. I mean, that's everybody's favorite sport. I mean, it's kind of like you don't mind it. But Germany has a responsibility. Germany should be accepting responsibility for being playing a more leadership role inside Europe, inside NATO, all these other things, nuclear sharing, 2%, do we use drones? Can we fire a weapon off of a drone? These are symptoms of a bigger issue, which is a lack of a sense of confidence in their strategic role in the world. And that's what drives the administration crazy. I mean, Nord Stream 2 makes no sense, even to the strongest American advocates of Germany. So it's this incongruity of policy makes it easy for this president to hammer the Germans and justify what he's doing to them for domestic consumption.
And you've taken us into sort of really the heart of the issue. And I wanted to come to you, Claudia, to respond to some of the things that Ben said, but also to maybe frame the question a little bit differently and ask you when it might become salonfähig, when it might become acceptable for Germany to talk more openly about its national interests. Because I think that that's kind of at the heart of this leadership question that Ben Hodges is talking about.
Yeah, I totally agree with Ben that the transatlantic relationship has never been sunshine and roses. I mean, it has always been complicated. But I have the impression that at least in the past, there was an overall agreement on both sides of the Atlantic that we are stronger together. And I have the impression that in the current situation, I'm not longer sure about this kind of basic assumption. And this is worrying me so much. And I agree on many levels where the interaction still works perfectly. I mean, we are an example of that right now in this debate. Huh? At the same time, you cannot really ignore the American president. Huh? And second, this already has effects. If you look at recent NATO summits, where allies have openly been quarreling about contributions, this is not the image of a united defense and deterrence alliance. And we all know that in terms of deterrence and defense, the political cohesion, the promise we are standing up to each other is as important as the military capabilities. Do we believe in that? And particularly, do our enemies believe that we are all standing up together? And if you then have this kind of public quarrels, disputes, this doesn't really help. And so far, we were always able to kind of keep the debates, you know, between us, but stand up together as transatlantic allies. And I have the impression that this is changing. And the question is whether we will be able to survive for 4 more years of that. Question mark. So this is what I'm afraid of. And I'm afraid of, and I agree with Ben, that Europeans have been talking about defense for probably 2 or 3 decades, but they have hardly been implementing it. So the criticism on Europeans not doing enough is totally correct. And I think also this is one of the reasons why this current decision and why this transatlantic relationship is hurting us so much, because we are not able to respond. And even if we were now to invest far more in financial terms and capabilities in human power, it would take Europeans up to 10 years to improve, even more, to improve their capabilities. So there is indeed a lack of answer, a lack of convincing answer from the European side. When will it become more acceptable in Germany to talk about national interest? I think we do start talking about it. There has been a change in the public debate. But talking is one element and implementation is the other. And I think it's just like it is with European defense. We have been talking about Europe being a global actor, of Europe needing to become or to reach European strategic sovereignty. It's all nice to talk about it, but in the end, you need to implement it in political and particularly in military terms. And this is where we have a problem. And if I look at the economic implications of the pandemic of COVID-19 on European budgets, this is not going to get better.
Claudia, let me follow up with a footnote with a question we just received from a viewer who writes, just yesterday, the press reported a Franco-German paper is proposing more integration of European defense capabilities. Will this move by the United States accelerate any move toward a more unified EU defense response?
I think European defense integration would progress if European countries feel threatened and if they would agree. And if you look around in Europe, you have so many European answers probably as you have countries. There's no European answer to the US. There are many European answers. And some countries feel rather threatened by Russia. Others feel rather threatened by terrorism. France had several terrible attacks on its own ground. So they feel less threatened by Russia, but more by terrorism. So there's no common European answer, and there's no common threat perception. And as long as Europeans don't really feel threatened, they will not really engage in defense. And I would also make a difference between defense as such and defense integration. I would already be happy if we would have more investment in capabilities. If we then would even be able to cooperate, to have synergies and cooperation, I mean, wonderful. But the first thing that would push Europeans to do more and to do more together would be to actually see a problem in the weak European defense. And as long as Americans are there, I think the pressure is not big enough.
Yeah, she's exactly right. Unless political leaders in Europe, particularly France and Germany, acknowledge that there's a threat, then no matter what happens, they're not going to spend one more euro. I mean, think the budget. I was so excited about this PESCO and that they were going to fix military mobility inside the European Union. The Dutch were the lead nation, and they had 6 billion euro were aligned against us specifically to fix military mobility. And then before COVID, so this is not because of before COVID, it went to 0. And now it just recently came back, it's like 1.5 billion or 1 billion, something like that. That's not enough to fix 3 or 4 bridges, let alone really address military mobility. So nobody's going to take this paper or anybody serious if you can't come up with a euro to address basic infrastructure challenges. So Claudia is exactly right. This is going to take real political courage for people to, for leaders to say, hey, look, all the threats that existed before COVID, they're still here. And I think this ultimately it falls back on Berlin to provide the leadership and to have a strategic outlook. Now, I would also say that the U.S. could be a lot smarter. Europe is the #1 trading partner for North America. I mean, the North American, European, or EU economic relationship is the biggest in the world. China's not close. 20 years from now, maybe, but right now, they're not even close. So it's in our interest that the EU is successful. It's in our interest that Europe is secure, stable. There's only been one war on the European continent since 1945, and that was during the breakup of Yugoslavia. That's it. When you think of every country in Europe, it's probably fought every other country 3, 4, 5 times over the last 500 years. So NATO works. The EU works. It's not elegant, but it works, and it's to our advantage. And so instead of treating the EU as if it's the enemy, North Korea is the enemy. The Chinese Communist Party is the enemy. The Kremlin is the enemy, not the European Union. So we could be a lot smarter and say, hey, look, we need you guys, Germany. You're no longer the front line the way you were in the Cold War. You're now the logistics hub, the transit for anything that the alliance has to do to prevent a conflict. So we don't need more German tanks, we need more German trains. So how about putting some money into DB cargo, expanding the capacity, providing cyber protection for Bremerhaven. And by the way, that'll count towards your 2%. That needle will start moving like that. I mean, because even the Greens, who probably will provide the defense minister or the foreign minister in the next government, could probably get behind something like that. Like, everybody wants better infrastructure. So the U.S. needs to be a lot smarter.
But honestly,
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Claudia.
What worries me, already prior to the pandemic, defense was at least in my country, a stepchild. This is not, you didn't get much support. The defense spending was rising since 2014. We had about 33 billion in 2014. We had 45 now, so this is going up. But it was a difficult thing to sell defense to the German public. If after COVID-19, we have a major economic crisis, and in Germany, we talk about an economic crisis which we haven't seen since Second World War, much bigger than the 2008 one. If this is true, and we don't know how this is going to develop, whether we're going to have a second wave or not, defense will be even more difficult to sell. If all policy areas will have to do cuts, defense will also have to do a cut. And this is what worries me, because the Bundeswehr, if I talk just about the German armed forces, have slowly but steadily been kind of reconstructed since 2014. If you cut it now, this is really going to be difficult. And the 2008 financial crisis has also shown that Europeans don't like to cooperate. They prefer to do national cutting of their spending and of their capabilities, and they don't like to abandon sovereignty and cooperate. So if we haven't learned that lesson in 2008, will we be able to learn it now in 2020? Personally, I have my doubts. At that time, we talked about bonsai armies in Europe because everybody wanted to keep this national army, nice and pretty, but actually we were not interested in having a European capacity to act. So if you now have again kind of defense budget that will be cut and little willingness to cooperate, but in the same time, a worsened threat perception with Russia, with the southern flank, this is deeply worrying, plus transatlantic problems.
Claudia, I'd like to maybe push you on that just a little bit because we do have a viewer question that goes along the lines of, can you realistically see other Europeans accept German leadership, particularly if this leadership includes military leadership?
There's a famous quotation of a former Polish foreign minister who said, "I fear a weak Germany more than I fear a strong Germany." And from the conversations I had in many European capitals, they would really welcome a stronger, militarily stronger, more committed Germany. I think it's mostly accepted that if Germany leads, it mostly in a cooperative way. It's a different way than other European countries, if I might say. So my impression from the conversations I had, there's support. There's even a calling for more European commitment. If you look at Germany, this is the one country who has now the biggest defense budget in Europe. If it's not Germany, who is going to do it? You will only have a major change in European defense capabilities if the French, the Germans, and the Brits team up. So we really need this German commitment, and most European countries recognize it. You have, for example, in the framework nation concept, which is a cooperation concept that Germany suggested, many smaller countries who closely cooperate with Germany, who orientate their defense spending, their acquisition processes with Germany. So I think there's a big responsibility where Germany very often is a little bit too shy to actually really live up to it.
Ben, I'd like to
Can I just pile on real quick? Claudia's, again, she's exactly right. Germany does a terrible job of taking credit for what it's doing. Back just right before COVID, I had the privilege to speak to a class here at Goethe University in Frankfurt. It was an international affairs class, advanced, probably about 50 students in the room, brilliant. They all spoke English better than I do. I mean, it was impressive, the questions and everything. And I asked, I said, how many of you are aware that Germany provides an enhanced forward presence battle group to Lithuania, Germany's contribution? 2/3 of them had no idea. That's incredible. I think Foreign Minister Sikorsky's comments exactly right. Everybody is looking for German capability. And when Germany said that we'll provide the EFP battle group to Lithuania, that put pressure on everybody else. Like, shit, we have to do it now too, because the Germans are doing it. That, that kind of a leadership and example. And Germany behind the scenes actually is a framework nation for 3 of the 9 core headquarters that make up NATO's force structure, the land headquarters. There's so many places where it plays a critical role. Should take credit for it.
Well, and actually, Ben, I want to follow up with you about that a little bit, and about less about Germany and more about the U.S. presence. I mean, you touched on it a little bit. I think it's inaccurate to say that the U.S. troops in Germany are there purely for NATO support. You just touched on the important location in Germany for U.S. force projection in other parts of the world. We've all heard about the importance of Ramstein Air Base and the Landstuhl Hospital. I think many people on this call know that U.S. military missions in Africa are run from a facility outside of Stuttgart. But can you talk a little bit more about how the Army and the Air Force operate out of Germany globally? Because I think that that's insightful. And then a follow-up question from one of our viewers, which is, if we really move forward with this, at a time when we're looking at a major financial deficit because of the economic crisis as a result of COVID-19, how does one justify abandoning these critical installations and the waste of US resources?
So, first of all, the footprint of what's here in Germany, 34,000, Eintracht, the stadium where Eintracht plays football here in Frankfurt, holds 51,000. So if you took every American in uniform that's in Germany, they would barely fill up half of Eintracht Stadium. So it's a very small number of people with a significant reduction in the number of installations that we have from what it used to be, that does all the things you just talked about. Ramstein, Spangdahlem, headquarters in Wiesbaden, Stuttgart, Special Forces and Air Defense and Logistics in Baumholder, our logistics hub in Kaiserslautern, and then, of course, best training area in Europe, Grafenwehr, Hohenfels. There's only one combat arms unit in all of these 34th of the Army, and that's in Vilseck, the Stryker Cavalry Regiment. So we're not talking about a lot of stuff. But if you wanted to try and move any of that capability to Poland, which is rumored, it would take decades to get back to the level of quality that Germany allows us to have. It would take a ton of money to housing, all the things that are required to maintain readiness. I mean, there's no point in having an Army or an Air Force if it's not ready. That's very expensive. Of course, it's not nearly as expensive as failed deterrence, but it's expensive. So it would cost a lot to walk away from this, and it would cost a lot to recreate it in Poland or Romania. And by the way, again, the administration reveals that that this is so political and has nothing to do with strategy when the president says, yeah, we'll get the number down to 25,000. And then, basically when Germany finally reaches 2%, we'll come back. This is not Kuwait or Afghanistan where we kind of just unilaterally say, well, we'll come and go and establish our own. This is a sovereign country that is an ally. I'm pretty sure that Germany will not let us come back, particularly after the way we've just kind of, smashed some dishes and stormed out the door or threatened to. If we hand over one of these barracks or give up a capability, especially, of course, Claudia would know better than me, but it feels like it's going to be the next coalition. The Greens are going to have a significant role to play. And so no matter how much the next chancellor or head of the CDU may want it, I would predict it will be very difficult to regain any lost bases, facilities. I mean, that would be very difficult to do. So the only people that are getting hurt with this decision, U.S., I mean, it's going to lower our security because we won't be able to do all the things you described. And I tell you who else is really unhappy. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania. Now, there's some loudmouths in Poland talking about, hey, bring them here, we'll be glad to have it. Anybody that thinks strategically knows that without the U.S. being able to rapidly reinforce through Germany, it lowers or it raises the risk on them of a terrible miscalculation by the Kremlin. That's why this is such a bad idea. It's not a decision yet. I mean, I think
I'd like to turn to Russia in just a minute, but we've gotten a number of questions about the timing and implementation of this. And Ben, you just started to touch on it. I guess the question is, if you were in your old job and tasked to move a combat and support brigade out of Germany, where would you move them? And since this is something that cannot be done in 60 to 90 days, what do you think the timeline for this sort of thing might be?
Well, again, in the absence of a specific order and formal guidelines, which has still not reached Wiesbaden or Stuttgart yet, you can only speculate. So let's just say, for example, one of the rumors that's out there, and of course, our ambassador in Warsaw has unfortunately been talking a lot about, hey, there's news coming, and there's speculation today about President Duda being in the White House here in the next few days. There's an election going on in Poland. I mean, there's a lot of stuff happening. And so the buildup is sort of that there's going to be an announcement, there's going to be thousands more Americans going to Poland. We have still not worked out the status of forces agreement. The legal permission and agreements required to have American soldiers in Poland for the rotational forces we've had there now for almost the last 3 years or so. So the idea that somehow you can pick up 500, 1,000, 2,000, whatever the number is, and of course, we don't even know what capabilities we're talking about, and just move them to Poland and expect it to be okay is amateur hour. I mean, the status of forces agreements that we have worked out between the United States and Germany over the last 70 years, where what happens if an American soldier's in a car wreck, or paying taxes, or the ability to fly helicopters at night. All of these things have taken decades to get to where we are. It's not perfect, but this is hard legal work. That's not going to happen between Washington, D.C. and Warsaw in the next 90 days. It's probably not going to happen over the next 2 or 3 years. It's complicated stuff. So that's another reflection. Now, mathematically, could we get 9,500 American uniforms out of Germany by the end of September? Yeah, sure. Go to Frankfurt, Flughafen, go to Munich, get on the plane, fly home. You have to assume at least 1/3 of them have families. And this is all happening during the time of COVID. I mean, that's why this is such a terrible idea that we're only hurting ourselves, and we're hurting the readiness of these units. And it's not our finest hour.
We've gotten a couple questions about Russia, and each of you has mentioned Russia briefly. According to German government officials, the reduction in US troops will not have grave consequences for Germany's security, but obviously it creates symbolic damage to the German-American relationship, as you talked about, Claudia. But it also has the potential to undermine Chancellor Merkel's position vis-a-vis Vladimir Putin. And I guess I'd like to start with you, Claudia, and then hear from you, Ben, about what this potential move could mean for future relations with Russia.
I think that the point that Ben just made were really, really important. If first, we don't know what's going to happen, but the point you made about the relocation, if you would like to relocate troops to, for example, Poland, it would be expensive, it would take a lot of time, but particular, I think it would weaken alliance cohesion and would rather, it might lead to a fragmentation because allies would certainly disagree on whether this is a particular smart idea. And then if the opposition inside NATO is too big, it might turn into a bilateral endeavor between the US and Poland. We are not there. And I hear from many Polish colleagues who said, we actually don't want those troops because allied cohesion is far more important. So I think this is really a very difficult issue for the alliance cohesion. And we have this document called the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which Russia has violated, but the alliance decided to keep the document. And in the document is, for example, this one paragraph where it says that NATO doesn't have the intention to put permanently substantial combat troops in that area. So if the US would relocate, which is not yet decided, those troops to Poland, it could be interpreted by Russia as an escalation, as a provocation. Again, Russia might interpret an escalation what they want to have an escalation. So I don't, I think there's a lot of perception, but it would actually probably make this relationship, which is already difficult, even more difficult. And this is a point on which I would really like to insist. Ben perfectly outlined who would not benefit from that move, who would not benefit from a withdrawal of troops. The question is who would benefit? And those who would benefit would probably be Russia and China. If you look at the alliance as a group of countries who promised each other to stand up for each other in times of crisis, and there's no groveling and saying, I take the troops here, I put them there, I don't talk to you, you learn it from the press. Is this a real credible defense alliance? Question mark. So this is already, this political debate, unstrategic debate, as Ben rightly said, is already weakening NATO and is already weakening deterrence and defense. And if the idea was, as we can read it in the press, if the idea was to hurt Merkel, I can just tell you it doesn't. It's not a problem for Merkel. She is not losing domestic support because of that decision. So this was a miscalculation. It is rather understood as the Americans taking a decision which actually hurts them far more than it hurts us. As I said, I do think it's a problem for European defense because we are lost without the US, but it's not something where Merkel would say, oh my God. So this is a really important point to understand. It doesn't hurt the German government.
Ben, any thoughts on the Russia question from you?
Well, this is a gift to the Kremlin. I mean, in return for doing nothing, no change behavior in Donbass or Crimea, no change behavior in Georgia, Transnistria, no change behavior in Syria, Libya, or all the other threatening things that they're doing, the cyber attacks on German government and other places. In return for doing nothing, they get a 28% reduction in US capability in Germany. I mean, that's not part of the deal. That's a hell of a deal. I don't think Putin can believe his luck to get something like that. For the Chinese, I would imagine it's to their interest that there is friction between allies. Look, I hope I'm wrong, but I mean, there is a real possibility of a kinetic conflict between the United States and China in the next 5 to 7 years. I mean, nobody wants that, or at least nobody I know wants it. I think maybe some in the Chinese military in their heart of hearts actually do want this. But when you look at what's happening in Hong Kong, the language of the Chinese Communist Party towards Taiwan, China's activities in the South China Sea, not just building these islands, but they're militarized fishing vessels out smashing Vietnamese and Philippine fishing vessels. All of these things were kind of on that sort of a trajectory. The US is going to need allies more than ever because we do not have the capacity to deter Russia and be in a conflict with China and contain Iran and help maintain the global commons. So if we ever needed allies, it's now. And so I think the Chinese are probably rubbing their hands together a little bit like, oh, we didn't have to do anything, and we're getting this.
But Ben, let me push you on that a little bit with a somewhat provocative question that I'm reformulating from one of our viewers, which is in light of the growing military threat from China, particularly in the South Pacific, doesn't it make sense for the US to reduce, if not fully redeploy, its forces from Germany and rebalance to Asia?
Well, you remember President Obama talked about a pivot to the Pacific. While that was not the best choice of words, because pivot means turn away from one to go somewhere else, nonetheless, he's right. And the Trump administration also is preparing for competition, not just in military, but in all spheres. And so back to my previous point, we don't have the capacity to do it all by ourselves. So it's still in our interest, if you accept my earlier point that our economic interests are tied to a stable, secure, and prosperous Europe, then we should be working as close as possible. So, hey, Germany, we're counting on you. Instead of saying, we're leaving because you're not doing enough. And by the way, most of the things that are in Germany are not what's needed in the Pacific. What's needed in the Pacific is Navy, intelligence, air and missile defense, moving a transportation battalion from Baumholder to where? I mean, what's it going to do in the Pacific? That's not what's needed. It's not land forces. Now, the Air Force, that's a different story. The Air Force transportation, air refueling. I've heard that the F-16 squadron at Spangdahlem might be one of the elements that would leave, but we don't know that it's going to Pacific because there's no plan. I mean, this is not the result of strategic analysis. So, so the question is a fair question, and the answer is yes. Of course, the priority is going to be to the Pacific. What's happening that we're talking about now, is nowhere close to being part of a solution or an answer to that question.
It won't come as a surprise to either of you that we've gotten a number of questions about the 2% debate. And it certainly was not a surprise to learn that President Trump said that he would cut the troop presence until Germany increased its defense spending, and even went so far as to say that Germany has been, quote, delinquent in its defense spending. Some would argue that the cutback is a negotiating tactic to get Germany to spend more on defense. But I guess the question is, and Ben, you started to touch on ways in which Germany could increase its defense spending to meet the 2% of GDP goal by 2024. It is important to note that since 2014, Germany has increased its defense budget by about 40%. But I think the big question that a lot of observers have is, if Germany massively increased its defense spending right now, where could those funds go? It seems as if the Bundeswehr is in need of some spending when we hear about planes not functioning and not having the operability that it needs. But Ben, I'd also like to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about the infrastructure question. And then Claudia, maybe turn to you about how do you think that increased defense spending would be perceived in Germany?
So for sure, the Bundeswehr had gotten to a level of readiness that was not only unacceptable, but embarrassing. My friends in the Bundeswehr and people in the Bundestag that understand this, and the minister, they know that this is not where they should be. I mean, the one nation in the world that's automatically associated with engineering, it was incomprehensible that they would have equipment that didn't work. It made no sense. But this is not because officers and sergeants in the German army forgot how to do maintenance on tanks. They're paying the price for political decisions that were made 10, 12 years ago that affected how repair parts are delivered. The way the system is set up to help make sure that the 1st Panzer Division's vehicles or the German Navy, Andreas Krause's submarines, that they can all operate, the manning, all of these things. So the people in uniform are paying the price for a political decision that was made probably 12, 13 years ago. Claudia will fix that for me. And it, with money, but also with emphasis and a very enlightened leadership of people like General Zorn, the Inspector of the Bundeswehr, is moving in the right direction. So actually, the priority for defense spending in the Bundeswehr, in the ministry, has to be on readiness. Fix what you have. I mean, the Army has 3 divisions. They have a very important question, obviously, for the Air Force, for the Luftwaffe, about next, what do they need? And this is tied to nuclear sharing role. But nonetheless, make sure that you're continuing to modernize and that what you have works. That's got to be the priority, readiness. It's unconscionable that young men and women of the Bundeswehr would be sent on a mission without having everything they need and having the best possible stuff. But after that, I'll say it again, we don't need more German tanks, we need more German trains. Right now, there is just enough capacity in DB Deutsche Bahn Cargo to move 1.5 armor brigades simultaneously in Europe. That's not 1.5 German armor brigades, that's 1.5 total. And the US Army, the German Army, the British Army, the Dutch, everybody is going to be competing for that same 1.5 brigades worth of rail cars. Why not incentivize spending, purchase more capacity on rail that can be used, that can be provided on very short notice, and that should count towards 2%. The port of Bremerhaven, for the military, is probably the most important seaport in all of Europe. Who's responsible for the cyber protection of Bremerhaven? It's not German Ministry of Defense. But if a cyber attack hit Bremerhaven and shut it down the way the Russian NotPetya cyber attack shut down Maersk about 3 years ago, it's the same thing as if 10 Iskander missiles landed on top of it. So the cyber protection for airports and seaports that we all need, that should count towards 2%. Last example, research and development. All my German friends tell me that there is a law, or at least policy, that says no university can or will do research that has military value. Well, to me, this is an ethical problem. Why would university, I mean, I understand where it came from, but why would a university not do research that leads to the best possible battlefield healthcare in case a young man or woman of the Bundeswehr was wounded, or to provide the best possible protection for them? So it seems to me that in US, we have DARPA, and we put hundreds of millions of dollars into DARPA for research and hope we get a 10% return on that investment. Why not do that with German universities and research and development that has dual use? Count that towards 2%. That's an incentive for startups, all kind of people.
Claudia, over to you. Any thoughts on defense spending in general? And then I have a specific question for you as well.
So I think we all agree that Germany needs to spend more. But I think the point which is really important to make in Germany, it's not we need to spend 2% or need to spend more to please the US, but because it is our own interest of defense. It's not a present to Trump. It's because we have to understand that defense matters. And this is a point I think which is really important to understand, that in Europe, we were able to set up, to build a political entity with the European Union, which is marvelous. but it's not able in military terms to protect itself. And this is highly irritating. So we depend in Europe for our military protection from the US. And we should be ashamed of it. I mean, that's maybe a bit strong ashamed, but I think this should really irritate Europeans. And that's why the 2% is not something we owe Trump or we owe NATO. This is something where the Europeans should say, we need this for us. So that's a very important point. If Germany, depending on the economic power it has, if Germany would spend 2%, it would be roughly 90 billion. That's a lot of money. And it's in relationship to the other European big spenders like France and the UK, a lot more. So that's something we should really underline. And given the current structures of the German armed forces and the kind of German military administration, I'm not sure we would be able to spend this amount of money, if it would come right now, very wisely. So I think we would need a bit of time to spend it in the way Ben described. And indeed, the German armed forces are paying now the price for many years of mismanagement. Spare parts have been cut, modernization has been cut, and all those structural thinning out of the armed forces, you don't rebuild it overnight. It really takes more than 4 years. The changing point for the German armed forces was 2014, the annexation of Crimea and the war on Donbass. That for Germany was the return of collective defense to Europe. And this was a moment when Germany agreed to spend more on defense. It's the return of collective defense. And I mentioned the numbers earlier. Defense budget in 2014 was 33 billion. We are now at 45. So that's really a difference. I'm really worried that this rebuilding, which we have been observing for the last year, will be stopped by the economic consequences of COVID-19. The economic consequences, the economic fallout, but also the political. We don't know how Europe as a political entity is going to cope with this crisis. Are we able to stand up together? Is kind of populist or Eurosceptical movements gaining power? Is the European idea as union put into question? That would have serious repercussions in political and military terms, particularly on Germany, because we perceive ourselves as kind of being the European country. And it will be increasingly difficult to make the case for defense. It has always been difficult in Germany, but it somehow worked since 2014. But we need to kind of make a clear case for the threat perception. One would think this is easy with the SSC-8 from the Russians, with China and all that, but it remains difficult in Germany. So this is a political task which we need in the months to come. Somebody standing up for defense. And then, you know, this is a really difficult thing to do in Germany, particularly in difficult economic crisis when it's about where does this little money go?
Claudia, I have one specific question from a viewer, which is, and I want to thank you for that broad context too, because I think that that's important. And this maybe drills down into the weeds a little bit, but do you think that the specific decision to reduce the US military presence in Germany will affect the decision in Germany, which was supported by the defense minister, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, to buy US F-18s?
My very short answer is no. I can go a little bit more into detail. The F-18 decision is so far a political decision. The real decision taken by the parliament, also for the financial dimensions, will be taken by the next parliament. We have elections in Germany next year. So the real kind of definitive decision will not be taken under this government, but will be taken by the next government. And we are now in a time which in political and economic and security terms is so moving so quickly that I would be very cautious in doing any conclusions. So I would say, let's wait for the parliament to give the money to decide upon it. And we will have a decision with the next parliament. I'm really doubtful whether this is really definitive.
So we're pretty much out of time, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask each of you a closing question. Obviously, this is a period of tremendous uncertainty, but we've talked a lot, you've both talked a lot about leadership questions and about what Germany can do, what Germany should do. And I guess as you look forward, my question to you, Claudia, would be, what can Germany do on the world stage to show leadership? And Ben, my question to you as a closing question would be, what do you think the US can or should expect from Germany? Who wants to go first?
You want to start, Ben?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I thought that he had asked you first. Well, what we really expect of Germany is that they elect Claudia Major as the next Bundeskanzlerin. But if that's not the case, then let me come to number two. What we really need is is Germans not to lose faith and confidence in their American ally and their American friend. And I don't mean this in some kind of a, flowery sort of way. I'm serious. I mean, most Germans know the United States. Practically every single German I know has either studied in the U.S., holidayed in the U.S., sent their kids to school in the U.S., or has business connections, or has lectured in the U.S. We're not perfect. I mean, it's 300 million people, and we have a pretty good system of elections. We have a Congress that has demonstrated that it supports NATO. I mean, bipartisan, very strong support. You saw the letter from not only I mentioned Senator Inhofe, but also the 22 Republicans from the House that came out and said this was a terrible idea. So the Congress has been supportive of NATO regardless of what the administration has said. And so I would say, I would never make a prediction about election, by the way. What I'm saying is there's a process. And even if there is another term with President Trump, that we respect the outcome of an election, but an administration, even a two-term administration, is not going to destroy a relationship that's based on shared values. So even though we have different policies, and I like Claudia's sort of Greek temple metaphor, maybe the pillars are different, but that foundation really is based on shared values. And so I hope that Germany will not lose confidence in the United States, but I also hope that Americans will not lose confidence in Germans. I mean, there are a lot of things to be frustrated about. But the relationship, this is the most important relationship that we have in the world, and we need to preserve that.
I think over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, Germany somehow realized that it's not a big Switzerland and that it cannot hide away from being an economic powerhouse in the middle of Europe. So this recognition is there, but sometimes it's somehow forgotten. And what I would wish for is that Germany not only recognizes this not being a big Switzerland more clearly, but also that it guides far more the policies Germany is doing. We will have a new government next year, and I'm really hoping that we have a government or coalition government that is actually willing and enthusiastic about going into government and has an ambitious plan and motivation to get things done and change things. So it's not about managing Germany. This is perfectly done in the moment, but it's actually creating something. It's having bold ideas. And this is what I'm actually hoping for. And then it would be having this idea of leadership that takes the other European countries with us. Germany always prides itself of being the advocate of the smaller countries. We should do that. And then together with the other countries in Europe, be it France or the UK, standing up together and forging a bigger group of countries to bring in European voices in NATO, in the UN, and actually trying to preserve and reform an international order from we, Germany, benefit so greatly. We cannot pretend that we can cut ourselves off the world. We are deeply interdependent in political, economic, financial terms. So we should stand up far more for the international order and stability from which we benefit in so many ways. And that requires stronger political commitment, but also stronger military and other commitments. And something which is not nice to recognize is that if you take up responsibility, you might not please to everybody. So you will certainly be criticized. And I think this is something which is not nice to learn, but which I hope that probably the next government will implement stronger, and maybe also within your American government, if I might dream a little bit.
Well, Claudia Maia, Ben Hodges, I want to thank you so much for this rich and insightful conversation. It easily could have continued on. I want to thank you for fielding so many questions and covering a lot of territory. But I also want to thank our viewers for posing a number of excellent questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. There were just too many. But thank you for your active engagement and active involvement. And I wish you all well. But Claudia and Ben, a big thanks to both of you.